Thank you, Doug. Thanks to you and Ben and others for inviting me here yet again. I'm sorry Truman Katz couldn't be here. I just want to again express my admiration to him for the foresight in creating this fantastic Pediatric Bioethics Center, which this conference is really one of the great products, and the wisdom of inviting two of my former disciples, Ben and Doug, to head it and play such a major role in it. So it's always a pleasure to be out here, and sorry Truman couldn't be with us. When Doug called me about a year ago about the topic this year being adolescents, I was reminded of Robert Morley, the great British comic actor, who was asked once why he quit school at age 12. And he said it had to do with an exam question. The question was, describe and discuss the Cape of Good Hope. And he said, I wrote on the exam booklet, I don't have the foggiest idea where or what the Cape of Good Hope is, but I do know the names of the 12 apostles. And he wrote the names of the 12 apostles and said a few words about each. And he said, they flunked me, and it convinced me once and for all that they weren't interested in what I did know, but only what I didn't know. So I told Doug I really didn't know a lot about adolescence, and I wasn't particularly fond of talking about adolescence. I'm not crazy about adolescence in general. You know, it's one word that encompasses people from the age of 12 to 19, which is about as disparate as you can get, so it seemed to me crazy to talk about it as sort of one group of people. I said, however, I do give an entertaining talk about performance-enhancing drugs, and I'd be happy to do that. And maybe I could say a few words about the relevance to adolescence at the end. And Doug said that would be okay. And I thought there were some generalizable lessons about ethics in it, so if this doesn't come off, you can blame Doug. Everybody in this room uses performance-enhancing drugs, from caffeine in the morning to alcohol or Viagra at night. Every parent tries to enhance their children's abilities in one way or another, from Suzuki lessons to the best possible schools. Every parent asks their pediatrician, pretty much every parent, to enhance their child's perfectly normal immune system by giving them immunizations. Every athlete since the beginning of time has tried to enhance his or her performance, whether it was the first naked Greek putting on shoes, or somebody using a pole to get over the high jump better, or contemporary athletes carbo-loading or training at altitude to raise their hemoglobin. So it's always been peculiar to me and, frankly, ununderstandable as to why we're conducting this witch hunt for people who use one of the thousands of ways in which athletes and others enhance their drugs, anabolic steroids and some other drugs, to the point of sending people to prison for doing something that it seems to me is not very different from what all other athletes and most other people are doing. The claims that there is some moral foundation for this witch hunt have always seemed to me morally incoherent, hypocritical, insincere, inconsistent, and based on bad facts. And what I'll try to do in the next half hour or so is to tell you why I think that's true. This, by the way, is an interesting case study of a common phenomenon in bioethics in which there's a certain behavior or action, such as using these performance-enhancing drugs, that is uniformly condemned. As far as I know, everybody in the world has been against this since the beginning of time, except for myself. One reporter from NPR called me the loneliest man in America about 10 years ago. But that's changing. There are now innumerable academics, sports writers, HBO, Real Sports, a reporter named Armin Katayan, who apologized on the air for telling this story wrong for 20 years and said he was now convinced that he had it all backwards. And in fact, in a survey in New York about a year and a half ago, 1 in 3 people thought that the campaign against performance-enhancing drugs had no real foundation. So with that as introduction, let me just make some preliminary comments. My comments for most of this talk are just going to be about competent adults, and will, as I'm sure you've been talking about all day, where that boundary begins and ends is up for grabs. It certainly doesn't begin on one's 18th birthday. So one of the problems with adolescence is that when young people achieve this state of competence or capacity is uncertain. But for the beginning, I just want to talk about people that everyone agrees are competent, people in their 20s and so on who have all their faculties. The risks to very young children are very different than to older adults. Permanent growth attenuation and stunted permanent adult height being probably the most visible. So that's one reason among several to have a strict prohibition of the use of these drugs against small, still growing children, and I'm totally opposed to that. I think anybody who peddles these drugs to young children should be hung, followed by a fair trial. And so obviously adolescents are somewhere in between, and at the end I'll say a few things about that. There are half a dozen drugs that are alleged or shown to have some performance-enhancing ability in athletic competition. I'm just going to focus on steroids as the paradigm case. It's the most common one. It's the one about which we have the most medical evidence for benefits and risks, and about which most of the debate occurs. So what are the claims of those who say that this very common activity of trying to enhance one's performance, in this case on the athletic field, is morally suspect? The claims are, first, that they are unfair. They give the user an unfair advantage over his or her competitors. I'll come back to each of these. Second, that they're harmful, and that the leaders of sport owe it to these athletes to protect them from their bad judgment and causing serious, irreversible harm to themselves. Third, that they're coercive, that even if you don't want to use them, you have to, because if your opponents are using them, then you have to use them too if you want to compete. Fourth, that they're unnatural and violate the spirit of sport. This isn't what God had in mind when he or she created athletic competition. Fifth, that they constitute an example of enhancement. It's a misuse of medicine. Treating people with diseases is okay to try to bring them up towards a normal level of functioning, but taking perfectly normal, supernormal people and making them better is an inappropriate use of medicine or healthcare. And last, that they violate the integrity of records. They erode fan support, fan trust in what's going on, and make it impossible to know whether Barry Bonds is better than Henry Aaron and whether Aaron is better than Ruth, and so on. So let me say something about each of these, because I think all of them are either incoherent, inconsistent, hypocritical, disingenuous, insincere, or based on bad facts. What about the unfairness claim? Well, certainly there's nothing unfair about having an advantage over someone else. Shaquille O'Neal certainly has had for most of his career an unfair advantage. He's bigger, stronger, faster, quicker than almost anybody who's ever played the sport. Carl Lewis simply runs faster than other people, and I could train till I drop dead, and I would never be able to run as fast as Carl Lewis. Our dream team, the first basketball dream team, defeated their opponents by an average score of over 40 points a game. There's nothing fair about any of these competitions. Nor is it unfair to seek a competition. Sports isn't just about taking your God-given abilities and using them. All athletes try to enhance whatever abilities they have and to gain an advantage over their opponents, whether it's through training or coaching, or using artificial externalities from shoes that cost hundreds of dollars, or fiberglass poles, or carbo loading, or training at altitude. So none of these ways of enhancing performance have generally been thought to be unfair. Similarly, changing the internal structure and function of the body is not unfair. Carbo loading is a common way of doing that. Gatorade is an unnatural performance-enhancing assist, and athletes, since time immemorial, rely on researchers and nutritionists and doctors to do research on and recommend special diets that will change the structure and function of their body and allow it to work better so they can win the race. What is unfair is unequal access. It's unfair when one person has access to any of these modalities, and that's part of the hypocrisy of this debate. In the 1988 Olympics, when Ben Johnson, the Canadian sprinter, had his gold medal taken away after breaking the world record for the 100-meter dash because he unequivocally had been using anabolic steroids, literally the same day in the same press tent that he was being vilified, Janet Evans, an American swimmer, who had just won a gold medal, bragged about the greasy swimsuit that American technology had invented, that we had kept secret from the Russians and the East Germans, and that she was quite sure had cut precious seconds off her time and enabled her to win a race that she otherwise might not have run. And somehow this was considered a great example of American ingenuity and how much better that we kept it secret. And she was called America's sweetheart and went on a lecture tour which still hasn't ended. So there was something peculiar going on in that press tent that day. Bobby Knight, the great basketball coach who, as you know, spent most of his career at Indiana University, was the bane of my existence as a University of Wisconsin Badger basketball maniac. I sat through 20 years of losing seasons of our basketball team, more than 20 years of losing every single game to Indiana. And at one particular game, I was sitting next to an individual who had played basketball for Coach Dean Smith at University of North Carolina, so a very sophisticated guy. And he was pointing out that in this particular game, Wisconsin had far the superior players. In fact, we had 4 future NBA players on our team and was losing by the same 20 to 25 points that we always did. And he was pointing out to me all the ways in which the Knight team was just more superiorly coached. And it seemed to me inherently unfair that our gifted athletes could not have the opportunity to compete because they weren't given the instructional information that the Indiana team was, and that if the NCAA was really concerned about fairness, then coaches like Knight should be rotated around the league. And Indiana should have to play with our pathetic coach for a year. Training facilities are unfair even within the Big Ten. These facilities are grossly unequal. I'm now on the athletic board, believe it or not, of the University of Wisconsin, and it's quite striking how unequal the training facilities are and why Wisconsin can't compete in some sports because of their inadequate training facilities. In some other sports, they have far superior facilities. People who live at altitude have an advantage over those who don't if they're distance runners or bicyclists and so on. So there are examples of unfairness in sports, some of which there is an attempt to equalize, but some of which there's not. So the usual solution to unfairness is to try to equalize access, not to prohibit these things. That is, when somebody comes up to the high jump and comes there with a pole, we don't say, well, that's immoral. We may say it's immoral for that event that year, but we just create a new event and say, well, everybody should have a pole, and let's just call it the pole vault. And when everyone uses a bamboo pole, but Bob Seagren showed up in the 1972 Olympics with a fiberglass pole, it seems to me appropriate to prohibit that. But by 1976, when everybody had a chance to use the fiberglass pole, everybody could use the fiberglass pole. We didn't have big symposia about whether fiberglass is immoral or not. We just say, so be it. Let's let everybody play with the same equipment. So the hypocrisy of tolerating clear unfairness while claiming that steroids somehow are a problem when it could be easily solved by simply granting universal access escapes me. Bud Selig, the commissioner of baseball, constantly refers to the steroid policy as being important for a level playing field, but presides over a league in which the Yankees have a payroll in excess of $200 million, and my beloved Brewers struggle with a payroll that's 1/4 or 1/5 that, some teams even less than that. And so every year, except one in the last 12 or 13 years, the Yankees get to the playoffs, the Brewers almost never. There's nothing level about the playing field, and Selig does nothing about it, and it could be solved easily the way the National Football League has solved it by essentially distributing income around, and that's why on any given Sunday, almost anybody can win in the National Football League, and you don't have the same teams year after year winning. If we wanted to take fair competition seriously in sports like football, we would have a limit of total weight for the offensive line. I don't care what it is, 5 tons, 10 tons. with modern technology, it would be relatively simple to have the players, before they went on the field, to step on a total line scale. And if you have a 350-pounder, then you might have to put in a 200-pounder to stay under the limit. Similarly, basketball could have a total height limit. The total accumulated height of your team can't be more than 30 feet or whatever number you want to pick. So we could have, in some sports, we do take this seriously. In wrestling, we don't allow 300 people to compete against 150-pound people. It's not all that difficult. But in fact, the University of Wisconsin football team is going to play Wofford College this year, and we already know that the average weight of the interior line on offense and defense is 50 pounds different for Wisconsin versus Wofford. This is not fair competition, and if we wanted to take fair competition seriously, we would prohibit that. So the fairness is, as I say, inconsistent, hypocritical, and tolerated and even praised when our guys are the advantage, have the advantage, like Janet Evans, and when the bad guys, Ben Johnson, versus when the bad guys have it. What about the claim that these drugs are harmful? Well, first, good ethics starts with good facts, and the facts of this issue are wildly distorted. The harm of anabolic steroids most of them are just made up. Most of it is just fiction, and the ones that are true are exaggerated logarithmically. So the poster child in this story is Lyle Alzado, an all-pro lineman for many years who did die of a brain tumor, which, and then admitted that he'd been using steroids his whole life. And a cover story on Sports Illustrated and the front page of the New York Times referred to anabolic steroids as the cause of this, without a single quote from a single physician or a single scientific article to support the claim. There is simply no evidence of any association between steroids and the kind of lymphoma that Lyle Alzado had. To my knowledge, he's still the only person in the history of the world to be on steroids and have this kind of brain tumor. So if the headline had said Lyle Alzado, alcohol drinker, or Lyle Alzado, Wheaties eater, had a brain tumor, that would have been a more interesting story, because I think there have been a few people on alcohol who have had lymphomas. But instead, it was attributed to the steroids, and to this day, in debates, he's constantly rolled out as the poster child for what happens to you. And Alzado himself, who was the only source of this connection, said this should be a warning to young people not to use steroids. Liver cancer was associated with oral testosterone, which is never used anymore. The modern injectable steroids, which are diluted out in the blood much more than an oral anabolic steroid, which goes directly to the liver. The injectables have never been associated with liver cancer. Occasional cases of cholestasis suggesting some potential liver toxicity, but never anything irreversible. Chronic heart disease is mentioned in every article. Stroke. They do change your lipids in a bad way. The good cholesterol goes down and the bad cholesterol goes up. And if you stayed on them for 20 or 30 years and had other risk factors, it could very well be a tipping point. But there are no epidemiologic studies showing any differential rates of heart attacks or strokes in users. And Gary Wadler, the official medical expert for the World Anti-Doping Association and the U.S. Olympic Committee, when asked on the air repeatedly, Dr. Wadler, could you name a single elite athlete who's ever died of a heart attack or a stroke while on steroids? He said, it's not on my fingertips. And when asked, can he name a single article that shows any higher incidence of heart disease or stroke, he can't do it. The New York Times ran a full-page story, and I mean full page, gave an entire page to an East German athlete named Heidi, who competed 25 years ago or so as a woman in track and field, and today is a man, and blamed it all, is now a transvestite, and blames it on anabolic steroids. And in the entire article, again, there's not a single reference to any other cases or any studies or any evidence or any quotes from a single medical expert as to any connection. But here it is, the New York Times putting this forth as an example of the toxicity of steroids. There are many harms of anabolic steroids: acne, hair loss, male pattern hair loss, deepening of the voice in women, infertility in men and women, usually irreversible when you go off them. So there are some undesirable and some permanent side effects, but most of them are mild or reversible and rarely, if ever, life-threatening. Serious harms, such as death, are very rare to overstate the case. The total number of deaths that have even been claimed to be attributable to steroids, as far as I can find, is a number less than 10, and at least half of those are very suspect. Famous, unfortunate young man named Tyler Hooton in Texas, who did use anabolic steroids, phenomenal athlete who used anabolic steroids and did kill himself, and this suicide was attributed to the steroids and still is. Tyler Hooton was also on SSRIs, which are known to be associated with suicidal ideation and behavior. He was depressed, and yet, for some reason, the press prefers to attribute his suicide to the steroids rather than to the drugs which have been proven to be associated with suicidal behavior. There are logarithmically more people who have died from playing football than from using steroids while playing football. There are over 100 recorded deaths from playing football. This is not used as an argument for banning football. It's occasionally used as an argument for making rules that might reduce the risk of death, but nobody says because 100 people have died from the sport, we should ban it. Many of those deaths, of course, are among minors. So this concern is disingenuous. Rules that, policies that really promote harm and that certainly tolerate it, such as getting the quarterback, are not allowed to go on. They are encouraged because this is at the heart of the economic appeal of sports like professional and collegiate football and hockey. There is a rule in football called roughing the kicker. Roughing is an overstatement. If you touch the kicker, the punter, touch him, literally touch him, it's automatic 15 yards and a first down. You're not allowed to touch him because he's in such a vulnerable position that he could get hurt. Well, if we had roughing the passer be defined in the same way as touching the passer, who's in the same vulnerable position after he releases the ball, we wouldn't have the endless parade of incapacitated quarterbacks who are out for the season. Over half of the quarterbacks who start the first game of the NFL season are not there at the end. So we could get rid of the harm of playing football. It's just that nobody would come anymore because the whole idea is about getting the quarterback and about getting defensive players who can get the quarterback. In hockey, similarly, fighting is not just tolerated, it's encouraged, certainly throughout the junior leagues. People are trained to be attackers, that is, fighters. And so when the president of the National Hockey League says he's banning steroids because he's concerned about the health and safety of the athletes, it should evoke laughter, not the sort of genuflection that it does. Criminalization of this, we're now talking about sending Barry Bonds to prison. Marion Jones is in prison or just has been in prison. Criminalizing it, of course, makes it more likely that if there are medical risks that they will occur. I'm not saying there are no serious irreversible harms from these drugs. It's just hard to know because it's hard to do studies because you can't get users to participate even in epidemiologic studies when they risk criminal prosecution, not to mention exclusion from the sport while they're still active. So there are concerns that I do worry about, such as prostate cancer, which is a hormone-dependent or responsive cancer, and it wouldn't amaze me if 30 years from now there was an increased incidence of prostate cancer in men using these drugs. We'll never find out because it'll be very hard to identify who the users are and to do a case control study. Furthermore, there is no oversight of the manufacturing process. All athletes who use these drugs get them illicitly from illicit suppliers in Mexico or Balco Labs in San Francisco. So nobody knows what's in those bottles, including hepatitis virus, AIDS virus, what the dose of the drugs is, whether it's what it says on the label. They're literally made in bathtubs in some situations. So if you're seriously worried about the harms of these drugs, this would be a very bad, criminalizing it is a very bad way to go about it. But so from a just strictly medical standpoint, the harm argument is inconsistent. Moreover, even if they were as harmful as claimed, it's not clear that we would be justified in these paternalistic prohibitions against athletes who use them. Paternalism is generally unjustified in American society. We do claim to value liberty above all other things. The burden is on the state or anybody else who's going to restrict the liberty of competent athletes. The sport itself, as I've mentioned, almost any sport, including baseball, more people have died playing baseball than from using steroids. But football certainly is far more dangerous than the drugs that football players use. One study showed a 90% probability of permanent disability if you play in the National Football League for 3 or more years. There is no such claim from using anabolic steroids. The claim of protection of others is disingenuous. There's two parts to this argument. One, that these athletes are bigger, stronger, faster, and they're more likely to hurt other people. Well, that's true, but they were getting plenty big and plenty strong and plenty fast long before steroids arrived. And most of the NFL is now steroid-free, and they're still plenty big and plenty strong and plenty fast. That is, football has always been, and now more than ever, is an incredibly dangerous and terrifying sport, and would be with or without steroids. So if one thinks that that's worth regulating, then we should limit the size of linebackers to 200 pounds or less, or some other way, or change the rules about roughing the passer. There's other things that we can and should do to reduce the phenomenal injury rate and permanent disability rate. There are claims about so-called steroid rage. There's no question that steroids make some users more aggressive, and sometimes to the point of criminal behavior. Rarely. The number of cases of steroid-using athletes who have committed criminal assaults is very small, and logarithmically smaller than the number of non-steroid-using NBA and NFL players who rape and drive drunk and assault people. Those numbers are astronomical. One study recently suggested that a third of all players in the NBA have had criminal charges for physical crimes. Drunken driving occurs almost weekly among elite athletes with very little recognition by the league. So violence against others, harm to others is a huge problem in high elite sports. Very little of it has anything to do with steroids, and so if the leagues or Congress were really concerned about violent athletes being coddled or tolerated, there are a lot more effective ways to go about it than banning steroids. Smoking and alcohol, far more dangerous and aren't regulated even within sports. Smoking, of course, would be virtually unknown in elite athletes, but alcohol, extremely common with, again, no regulation, no testing, and even when people are convicted of drunk driving, typically get back on the field very quickly. What about the claim that these are coercive? Tom Murray, the director of the Hastings Institute, has been writing about this for a while. The claim that even if you don't want to use them, you have to. If your opponents are using them, and that's why we have to ban them, so that people can be free to say no. Well, first of all, as Socrates said, the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their right name. So my dictionaries tell me that the word coercion means the use or threat of force. I don't know of any examples of that, at least not in the United States. No one's ever been forced to use steroids or threatened in any physical way if they don't. Or it means, second definition, depriving somebody of an entitlement, of something that they're otherwise entitled to, like food, shelter, or clothing. I don't know any examples of that. So coercion just seems to me an inflammatory word that is just not applicable. I don't know of any examples of it. There's some alleged in China and in East Germany, and it would be wrong. This involves the confusion of, or the failure to distinguish an offer from a threat. Coercion always involves a threat. Namely, if you don't do what I'm suggesting you should do, you'll be worse off than you are now. That's what a threat is. As distinguished from an offer, if you decide to use these things of your own free choice, you can be better off than you are. You can compete more effectively, you can make more money, you can get rich, you can get famous. It may be a dangerous opportunity, but it's an opportunity, it's not a threat. That is, refusing to use them doesn't make you any worse off than you presently are. It may mean that you don't get to play in the major leagues in the NFL, but that doesn't make you worse off than you presently are. There's no entitlement to be a professional baseball player or football player. It may involve risks, as it surely does, We don't say people are forced or coerced into getting tackled if they play in the National Football League and that it's therefore immoral. We say it's very dangerous to play in the NFL. If you're willing to put up with the risks, bring it on. If not, you're free to walk away. Another word that's used is exploitation, taking advantage of a person's basic need by doing something that would otherwise be wrong. We don't have enough time to talk about the complexity of that term, but exploitation is common in our society and in many cases justifiably so. Doctors exploit the fear of patients by offering exams and tests and diagnoses and treatments and make a lot of money from it. Oncologists doing clinical trials exploit the fear of people that they're going to die. Employers who sell blue-collar jobs in mining or construction exploit the need of unemployed people to work. But as long as these things are done in an otherwise ethically appropriate way, honestly, with accurate information, with appropriate safety precautions to minimize the risk, not to eliminate them, we don't call these wrongful cases of exploitation. So yes, the National Football League does take advantage of some inner-city youth who have no other way or few other ways of becoming millionaires. But that's true of coal mines in Appalachia, and we don't say that the coal mines are themselves wrongfully exploitative as long as they follow certain safety rules. Moreover, withholding opportunities for wealth is not a satisfactory solution to people who have no other way out of poverty. And so this argument of exploitation is generally not appreciated by those for whom professional sports, with or without steroids, is one of the few pathways they have to substantial wealth. What about the claim that these drugs are unnatural, which most of them surely are? It's hard to know why that would have anything to do with questions of morality or ethics. So under this claim, drinking lake water would be okay, running in your bare feet is okay, lifting rocks is okay, smoking marijuana would be okay, that's natural, and taking testosterone, which is the most dangerous of all the anabolic steroids, would be okay. But drinking Gatorade would be immoral because it's unnatural. Using Air Jordan sneakers should be prohibited. An elliptical machine should be prohibited, it's unnatural. Albuterol should be prohibited. And stanozolol, which is much safer than testosterone, should be okay. There's no coherent basis for preferring people on the left, drugs on the left-hand side, or entities from the left-hand side from the right-hand side. As I've said, testosterone, which is the most natural anabolic steroid, is the most toxic. That there's no reason why we should prefer it just because it's natural. The claim that sport has some natural essence is also incoherent. There was no football in the Garden of Eden. Football and baseball and hockey and track and field are all man-made inventions. They don't have any innate definition or essence. Tackling, passing, punting are not inherent to football. In fact, passing was a scandal when it first occurred in the early 20th century. It was front page news. Somebody threw a forward pass and big debate about the immorality of it. And after cooler heads prevailed, people said, hey, it's pretty cool. Let's add to it. Let's add it to the mix, even though it made the game more dangerous. Gatorade, carbo loading, and steroids are neither inherent to track events or inconsistent with them. We could have football without Gatorade or without steroids or without any of these things. There's no right or wrong to it. So to claim that somehow they should be excluded just because they're unnatural is to fail to provide any distinction between steroids and all the other unnatural things that are part of sport. What about this claim that they use of these drugs violate the distinction between treatment and enhancement, as if that's somehow a morally important distinction? I first got interested in this area when I was watching the 72 Olympics. An American swimmer named Rick DeMont won a gold medal in swimming and had his medal taken away because he tested positive for ephedrine. This is the sympathomimetic, the adrenaline-like drug that's in most cold remedies, and indeed he had gotten it from an over-the-counter cold remedy. DeMont had mild exercise-induced asthma, so mild that simply taking an over-the-counter ephedrine pill was all he needed. And he had been doing that for years before a race. Before the finals, the gold medal race, he asked the team doctor, by the way, I've been using this over-the-counter cold remedy. Is that okay? The doctor said, sure, without checking. In fact, ephedrine was on the banned list. Why it was on the banned list to this day, I don't know. There's no evidence that it has any enhancing characteristics in otherwise healthy people. So Demont was using it as treatment, not as enhancement or as a preventive treatment. And he wasn't trying to put one over on anybody. He wasn't trying to violate any rules. But nonetheless, he lost his medal. I and tens of millions of other Americans thought this was grossly unfair and that there was something weird about the rules. And it would led me to start looking into this question of why something like ephedrine was even on the list in the first place. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that Demont actually wasn't taking this for treatment. He was taking it for enhancement. That is, Demont, without the ephedrine, would still be swimming at the 99.99th percentile. He would swim laps around anybody in this room. He didn't need it. If he was just out swimming recreationally, he didn't have bad enough asthma to require even the ephedrine. He took it for one reason and one reason only, and it was the same reason that Ben Johnson took the steroids. It's to win the race, to win the gold medal, and to set a world record, all of which he did. There was a guy who was 5 standard deviations above the median. He didn't want to get back to normality, and he didn't want to even get back to his own baseline. He wanted to achieve a personal best, and that's why he took it. And I say, hats off to him. Why shouldn't he be allowed to take it? Just like other athletes train at altitude to have more oxygen carrying capacity or anything else that they do. So I don't think there is any coherent moral distinction between treatment and enhancement. And therefore, athletes who use one versus the other, I don't think are violating any rule. Enhancement is common in medicine, including pediatrics. Vaccines are the most famous and common example. We all treat children who are perfectly normal and try to enhance their natural, normal immune system so they can be better off than they would the way God made them. The educational system is an effort to enhance children's cognitive abilities, caffeine, Viagra, and so on. These things are ubiquitous. Sports training is generally about enhancement. It's not thought to be bad. So what? I don't see how it violates any important moral principle. Never before have someone argued that athletes should just compete the way God made them. They should just come out of the womb and start running as soon as possible. All athletes try very hard with the help of very professional coaching to take their God-given talents and bring them to a new, amazing level. So the ends of enhancement don't seem to be problematic, and I don't think there's any coherent argument as to why one means versus another should be tolerated or not. If it's okay to try to enhance your performance, why should it matter whether it's carbo loading or steroids or training at altitude or even genetic interventions? What about this claim that the records are no longer believable and that these drugs cause loss of trust by the fans? Well, this is just simply false. First of all, Barry Bonds and Mark McGwire are the most famous steroid users in baseball. We're the biggest draw in that sport in the last 20 years. Bonds himself is the biggest draw possibly in the history of sport. Every place he played, attendance went up by an average of 12,000 people per game in every single park. Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa famously saved baseball. The year after the baseball strike, when attendance was way off, the World Series had been canceled, and this home run race between McGwire and Sosa, both of whom were almost certainly using steroids at the time, drew fans back in and got people interested in the sport. To this day, I don't know that anyone's unhappy about that, or at least the claim that the fans didn't like it was belied by the numbers. Bigger, faster football has made it increasingly, and more dangerous football has made it increasingly popular. It's the most popular spectator sport in the country. If I had enough money to start a steroid football league, it would outdraw the NFL by whatever size stadium or TV contract I could get. Everybody would prefer the steroid league to the non-steroid league. Keith Hernandez, the all-star first baseman of the Mets, had to take 3 days off from work because of a cocaine scandal in which he was found to be peddling cocaine, not using, but peddling cocaine to other Major League Baseball players. He was uncovered at a trial in Pittsburgh, and after 3 days came back onto the field at Shea Stadium to a standing ovation. The New York Times wrote an editorial called 3 Cheers for Keith. The Mets fans didn't care that he was peddling cocaine. All they cared about is that our guy was back and playing first base again. I think it's the concern about the economic impact of banning these drugs that partially explains the hypocrisy. That is, if the NFL should shrink, or if home run production in Major League Baseball should go down, as there was some concern earlier this year that it was, that would be a big economic problem. Chicks love the long ball, guys love the long ball. If steroids produce them, that's what people want. But what about adolescence, which is supposed to be the theme of this conference? How does any of this apply to adolescence? I think it should be clear that competence, not age, should be the boundary for granting people autonomy. That is, just because you're 24 doesn't mean you get to make your own healthcare decisions. We need to know whether you have the capacity and the competence to make your own health decisions. And being 17 doesn't mean that you don't get to make your own healthcare decisions. We allow competent 17-year-olds to make at least certain kinds of healthcare decisions. So, as I'm sure Lainey Ross and Ellen Clayton and the others this morning, I'm guessing, agreed on, that the boundary of deciding who gets to make their own decisions should not be when you magically hit your 18th birthday, but when you achieve some level of capacity or competence. Well, accordingly, we allow adolescents to make their own autonomous choices in behaviors that are logarithmically more dangerous than steroids. We allow them to drink, drive, swim, play football, play hockey, and do things which are profoundly dangerous, that have resulted in tens of thousands of deaths a year, forever. And maybe you can say that's a reason for banning driving in adolescence, or banning drinking in adolescence, or banning hockey or football. But let's hear the argument about that before we talk about banning steroids. That is, steroids don't have, or are unlikely to have, the growth stunting effect that they would in younger children. So for a 16 or a 17, or certainly an 18-year-old young person who is thought to be competent enough to decide whether to drink or drive, or to drink and drive, we can't use, it would be inconsistent to use competence or capacity as an argument for not letting that person make a decision to do something that's much less dangerous, to use anabolic steroids to achieve some socially acceptable goal, namely to be an elite athlete, to get into the best college, and eventually to make a lot of money playing a professional sport. Some risks may be linked with the duration of exposure. I mentioned prostate cancer. It would make some biologic sense that the longer you're on these things, the more likely you are to get prostate cancer, that it might be dose dependent. I don't know if that's true. So these are reasons to have an open policy if adolescents are going to use these things, and by the way, they do. Anabolic steroid use by adolescents is somewhere between 5 and 10%, and goes down to middle schools. It's not just high school populations. Much of it is due to bodybuilding and looking good rather than being competitive on the playing field. But there is an alarming use of steroids by very young people. And so if we're concerned about the risks of it, the present policies are not deterring this use. Testing is uncommon in high schools and almost unknown in middle schools because it's too expensive. So if we're really concerned about risks to teenagers, it would help if we had more open policy so we could have more facts and information for them. It would help if they were on the table rather than off the table, so they could talk to doctors instead of to street people selling drugs or buying them over the internet. None of that would eliminate it, but I think we could cut way back on it and have more safe dosing and so on. In summary, the claims that performance-enhancing drugs are immoral are based on incoherent or inconsistent arguments or just bad facts. These claims seem hypocritical or disingenuous in the face of reluctance to address more serious problems in sports related to violence, for example, on and off the field. Athletes may prefer to play with or without drugs, just as they may prefer to play with or without passing, tackling, or helmets. These are preferences, not moral issues. If the athletes want to have a steroid-free league, it seems to me they're entitled to do that. I just don't think we should claim there's any great moral issue involved. And as somebody, if you don't like any of this, you could agree with the person who said if all the ethicists in the world were laid end to end, it would be a good thing. Thank you very much. I hope we have, well, I guess we'll have time on the panel for discussion.